On a fiercely contested battlefield, soldiers of the Hebronian kingdom spotted the enemy commander, Diana. The scent of blood clung to her armor, her breathing was heavy, and she knew she was hopelessly outnumbered. But the brave warrior was determined to take as many enemies with her as she could, charging furiously into the fray. Knights surrounded the heroine from all sides, and for a moment she felt fear and the desire to survive. Despite having been on the battlefield for over 20 years, she was just a pitiful, disposable pawn. But even so, a true warrior should not spare their own life, for that is a sign of cowardice. At one point, Diana fell under the enemy's fierce assault and was pinned to the ground. Then, Cornelius Heimann, the commander of the Hebronian Union army, stepped onto the battlefield, the very man she had fought against for 5 long years. The hero had had enough and ordered his men to remove the warrior's helmet, wanting to see his face. But a few seconds later, he was struck speechless with shock when he saw that the mad dog who had been giving him such a headache was actually a girl. Agrafena was defeated, and Cornelius wanted to end it all by killing their commander. But he could hardly bring himself to finish off such a beautiful lady with splendid, fiery red hair. She thought he was insane, which made the hero laugh. How could he have fought her for 5 consecutive years without going mad? He decided to give her a choice, letting her decide whether she wished to be remembered as a girl or as a knight. Hearing that he had developed feelings for her during this time and was letting her choose, Diana sneered, thinking what a terrible day it was. She was a girl, but also a knight. She was a knight, but also a girl. So she didn't see any incompatibility between the two. Cornelius was surprised by her words, asked for her name, and then introduced himself. He then wanted to hear her last words, to which she returned a smile and said she was afraid of pain and hoped for a single, clean strike. Cornelius smiled back and gave his subordinate a signal. Hearing the sound of a sword cutting through the air straight for her neck, Diana swore that in her next life, she would never touch a sword again. A second later, she snapped her eyes open to find herself in a bright room, lying on a soft, warm bed. She sat up, rubbing her head, and heard the voice of her maid, Olga, saying she would bring water for her to wash up. The protagonist looked at her, stunned. She hadn't seen her maid this young in a very long time. She suddenly realized she was back in her room at the Lesley Manor, a place she had almost forgotten. She felt this was just some kind of dream, so she lay back down. Olga thought her mistress was ill, but Diana insisted she was fine and sent the maid away. Nevertheless, the maid decided to call a doctor, while our girl settled in and comfortably closed her eyes. She had forgotten the last time she had felt such peace and tranquility. This dream was too good to be true, yet too real to be a figment of her imagination. Diana stood before a mirror, examining herself closely. Had she really gone back in time? She looked no older than 10, but one thing made her doubt if this was truly a rewind. The destructive power the heroine possessed, she somehow still had. Just then, a servant burst in to say that the master wished to see her. Diana remembered that this was around the time her life had taken a turn. The last time, she had gone to her father, who had decided it was time for her to learn to support herself. He gave her a choice, swordsmanship or a lady's etiquette lessons. This time, the heroine walked towards him with new resolve, determined to choose differently and change her fate. In her previous life, she had chosen the sword, which had led to such a tragic end. When she entered the Viscount's study, he stated that since his daughter was now 10, it was time for her to learn to support herself. His words were exactly as Diana remembered from the past. Dad wanted me to take up the sword and be truly useful to the family. She only now realized that the Viscount was actually quite young back then. Moreover, she used to be intimidated by his gaze, but things were different now. She almost felt a little sorry for the guy. Those thin hands had never held a sword, and he was so frail that Diana couldn't figure out why she had been afraid of him back then. She even accidentally imagined throwing him over her shoulder, and just then, the Viscount felt a chill run down his spine. He thought it would be better for her to learn swordsmanship, but to his surprise, she wanted to learn etiquette instead. She thought she probably wouldn't make a good knight, as she was weaker than her older sister, Regina. So she wanted to learn etiquette and become a lady. After her father heard her answer, Diana turned and left. On the way back to her room, she remembered that becoming a knight was brutal, and she really had to fight for her life. The heroine trained all day on the training grounds, and by the end, her hands could barely move. It was endless training, and if you missed a single day, you would fall behind the others. But Diana decided to cast aside all these useless thoughts because she was no longer a knight. She was going to become a lady. Dark clouds gathered, and soon a downpour began, which annoyed her a little. Suddenly, Regina appeared in the hallway. She had heard her younger sister was sick, but thought she looked fine. Moreover, the older sister knew she was taking etiquette lessons and thought she should stick to being a knight. What Regina couldn't understand was how a girl with dirty blood could ever become a noble lady. The heroine was stunned by this insolence, wondering what the hell she was talking about. Diana's mother was a princess of Agrafena, even if she was born to the king's concubine and not the queen. So the heroine decided to ask her sister if she knew who their maternal grandfather was. Regina knew he was the late king, but that meant nothing since the royal family had disowned her mother anyway. Hearing this, Diana finally remembered why she hated her sister so much. Regina was born to the Viscount's first brother and his late wife, a union of free love. Our girl, on the other hand, was born after a forced remarriage, and her mother had also passed away. The father made no secret of his favoritism. While Diana was bleeding and sacrificing on the battlefield, her sister lived a life of luxury. While our heroine struggled on the brink of death, Regina wore new jewelry every day, always living in opulence. But Diana had never been jealous of her position because she had earned power and wealth for the family with her own blood, sweat, and tears. Now she decided to make it clear that if her mother was truly disowned, then the Viscount's family was nothing but trash. The heroine also realized that her sister didn't understand the subtleties of arranged marriages and thought she needed to learn a thing or two. Regina was angered by these words and decided to forbid Diana from calling her sister ever again. The heroine just calmly agreed, which made Regina even angrier. She turned and stormed off. Diana gazed out the window, lost in thought, deciding she would never accept such a foolish girl as her sister. Later that day, the butler introduced the heroine to Baroness Williams, who would be in charge of her etiquette lessons. The lady in an elegant dress came forward and curtsied to the young Viscountess. Diana had never heard her name before and guessed her father had assigned her a tutor from some unknown family. As the heroine began to greet the lady, she thought that the Viscount just wanted her to give up on becoming a lady on her own. The only small problem was that she had never received any etiquette training to become a lady in her entire life. So when she tried to curtsy, she fell heavily to the floor in front of the Baroness with a loud thud. There was a dead silence in the air, and Mrs. Williams began to bite her lip nervously. For a moment, Diana wondered if it would be better to just give up on the whole idea. Afterwards, the Baroness began to train her in the curtsy. It was the foundation, after all, and praised her posture. She broke down each movement step by step, and Diana tried to follow, but it was a complete mess. Mrs. Williams had her repeat the same movements over and over, hoping for a better result. The shoes were another form of torture, as she had never worn anything like them before. After class that evening, the Baroness decided Diana needed to get used to the shoes first, so they would continue tomorrow. A few minutes later, Olga was very confused by her mistress's gloomy expression as she sat in an armchair, staring thoughtfully at the floor. Suddenly, she jumped up with a shout, deciding she could do it, which scared the maid out of her wits. She remembered that she had become a commander through sheer willpower. Diana stood in the middle of the room and began practicing the curtsy on her own, while the maid thought her behavior was a bit strange. The next day, she performed a perfect curtsy for her etiquette teacher, absolutely nailing it. The lady froze in the doorway, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. In fact, the girl had practiced all night, while Mrs. Williams stood by, thinking she had been made a fool of yesterday. If she was so good at this, why did she act so clumsy yesterday? Moreover, the Baroness hoped she wouldn't start spouting nonsense about learning it all in one night. But it was the truth, and Diana didn't understand why she would bother to play a trick on her. The lady couldn't understand it until her gaze fell on the girl's heels. She was horrified by the wounds, but the girl calmly explained it was just the shoes. Mrs. Williams wanted to call a doctor, but Diana felt it was unnecessary, saying they were just scratches, not broken bones. Her words stunned the Baroness, who couldn't understand why the maids hadn't reacted to the wounds. The girl remembered them asking her a few times if she was okay, then quickly changing the subject. Mrs. Williams had her suspicions before, but now she was completely certain that this family was simply neglecting the heroine, sending a baroness from a remote region to be her tutor, and the servants not caring at all spoke volumes. The lady immediately barked orders of the maids to fetch a doctor and bring slippers for the young lady. While Diana's wounds were being treated, she decided to make it clear that the girl needed to start with her mindset. A lady's body is a treasure and must be protected from any scratch or damage. Do you hear me? Only then will people truly cherish you. You must stand out at all costs. The heroine was taken aback. She thought she had escaped her future by choosing another path, but bam, she was back on the battlefield of high society. Mrs. Williams decided to see if Miss Diana was ready to fight this war for attention. The girl just smiled, thinking, hey, this could be fun. The lady extended her hand, saying she was willing to help her win every battle. Diana took her tutor's hand, which felt as light as a feather, because war was basically her specialty. Every year, the royal family held a grand banquet at the palace for Orville Day. All the nobles of the kingdom were obliged to attend this gathering, under the pretext that it was a place of friendship and harmony. For high society, in other words, it was a battlefield where hypocrisy and fake smiles were the weapons, not swords and shields. If it were a normal battle, the heroine wouldn't doubt herself for a second, but this was going to be tough. She attended the party with her father and sister and managed to slip away to a balcony with an excellent view. She walked to the railing, mesmerized by the starry sky, completely lost in thought for a few seconds, and then she noticed something strange. There was a white-haired child below, and upon recognizing him, Diana received a huge shock. It was Cornelius Heimann, standing in front of the palace, looking straight at her with an intense gaze. The heroine looked back, completely confused, wondering what on earth he was doing here. This seemingly harmless child would grow up to be the commander of the Hebronian Empire. Suddenly, a knight grabbed her hand and pulled her away from the railing, thinking it was too dangerous to lean out like that. His name was Bancroft Crawl, and he wanted to know where the young lady's guardian was. In her past life, she would have punched him for grabbing her without permission, but now she had to act like a lady, and Diana politely ordered him to let go. The knight immediately jumped back and offered his sincerest apologies. The heroine immediately looked outside, saw no one, and for a moment thought she had been mistaken. Meanwhile, Bancroft thought he really shouldn't have grabbed her like that, but still felt she shouldn't be wandering around here alone. At the same time, Diana had trouble recognizing him because of his young age and remembered that this knight was said to have held a low-ranking position for a long time. She wanted to stay here a little longer, so the hero decided to stand guard. Many people thought he wasn't promoted because he was a loner, but that wasn't the real reason. The heroine introduced herself, and he told her that Bancroft was from the Crawl family, which was not a hereditary title, meaning the title was not passed down in his family. So basically, he was a commoner. That was why they were slow to promote him. Now, the hero thought that if the young lady minded his background, he would bring another knight. When she replied that a knight is judged by his sword, not his bloodline, and Diana acknowledged him as a worthy soldier, Bancroft was completely stunned. Those words deeply moved him, and he decided the young lady could call him Ben. The heroine understood that he might be going through a tough time now, but he needed to stay strong, because in the future, every knight would look up to this man. Meanwhile, Walter was shocked by the young master's behavior, that he would even try to sneak into the palace. Although the servant was completely terrified, young Cornelius was thrilled to have finally seen her in person. Walter was even more shocked, wondering if anyone had actually recognized the young master. Recently, our young hero had been having dreams about a certain red-haired female warrior. She was always sighing, gazing at the sky, and thinking about how tired she was of everything. Meanwhile, Cornelius was shocked to find that just by looking at this woman, his craving completely vanished. This strange craving had been plaguing him ever since those memories suddenly appeared in his mind. He had become like parched land, and this warrior was like the sweet rain he needed. After that, the young hero began to observe her life in his dreams, even seeing the first time she picked up a sword. He also saw her first battle battle, and the fateful night, that girl's life was cut short. Besides her, he saw an older version of himself, and he was clearly insane. Perhaps it was that craving that finally drove him completely mad. When he heard she wanted a single, clean strike, the boy rushed to save her. But he woke up then, and with the girl's death, the dream stopped. But now, he would do anything, just to see her smile again. So he ordered Walter to hand over his dagger, which completely confused the servant. Cornelius took the knife and cut off his long hair, wondering if he could meet the heroine on the battlefield. The young hero was determined to see her no matter what, even if it meant learning swordsmanship. The next day, Mrs. Williams decided to have a lesson on etiquette theory and wanted to know Diana's thoughts. What is a lady like? The heroine, with a serious expression, began to list various options, from just a girl to a noble in a dress. The lady quickly clarified that a lady is a creature that needs constant protection, because anything of value needs to be cherished, and this is the foundation of any lady. So she now wanted to know what the heroine thought the word really meant. When the girl retorted that she was a lady, the lady choked on her tea. She calmly wiped her mouth with a napkin and reluctantly agreed that the answer was correct. The lady knew that no one in the entire manor cared about this child, and she certainly couldn't help her in high society. Diana needed to learn to protect herself, and for that, she needed a weapon. Therefore, Mrs. Williams thought she could use her natural beauty. For a lady, beauty is a huge advantage, especially if you have red hair. Diana was frustrated and didn't want to use it, as she had always hated her hair color. For a night, red hair was useless at best and usually just got in the way. Because of her striking appearance, she had to endure many insults, but the same thing wouldn't happen a second time if you taught him a lesson the first time. So the tutor wanted to know who exactly would protect the heroine once she left the manor. She couldn't understand. Was Diana really not planning to get married? She needed to win hearts, and her appearance could definitely help with that. Starting with the maid Olga was a good idea. Mrs. Williams knew the maid was always around, and the heroine needed to win her over. The heroine really didn't want to deal with this, but if she was no longer going to pick up a sword, she needed some kind of defense. After class, she began to think that if she didn't become a knight, she would almost certainly have a marriage of convenience. Suddenly, she ran into her sister and her etiquette teacher, who decided to call it a day. The guy looked super annoyed and said that if she kept showing up so unprepared, they would have to stop the lessons. This wasn't the first time the teacher had scolded Regina, who just stood there wailing. Afterwards, he stormed off, hoping she would be ready for tomorrow's lesson, while the heroine continued down the hall. When Diana walked past her without even a glance, the sister flew into a rage. She immediately stopped crying and started yelling at the protagonist, convinced her sister was mocking her. Diana scratched her ear, completely baffled as to why this little one was barking like a dog again. She ignored the shouting and continued to fantasize about getting married, hoping the man would at least be good-looking. Suddenly, our girls saw Olga walking towards them with a basket of laundry. She immediately remembered her tutor's advice about winning over Olga, and that inspiring sympathy was the best first step. Beauty attracts attention, but when mixed with sadness, it inspires people's protective instincts. And now, she had a perfect opportunity to test this theory. The protagonist put on her most pitiful expression and apologized to her sister, claiming she should have been helping her all along. Regina was stunned, staring at Diana in disbelief. The heroine felt bad for not being a source of support for her sister and apologized with tears in her eyes. Olga was stunned by the young lady's appearance and words and couldn't suppress her admiration. The sister kept demanding an answer, and Diana realized from the maid's reaction that she was doing it perfectly right. She thought it was easy and suddenly pinned Regina against the wall, which really scared her sister. She smiled at her, a smile that almost turned Regina's hair white with fear, and Diana decided again that she must help her sister in everything. At that moment, the girl's heart sank to the pit of her stomach. Her soul left her body, and she turned pale with fright. Furthermore, the admiration on Olga's face vanished, replaced by confusion. The maid was now completely bewildered. Overall, the heroine was satisfied and congratulated herself again for doing it perfectly right. But suddenly, Regina screamed loudly and started calling for Dad, which left Diana at a loss. This was not what she wanted at all, but it was too late. Her sister had run to the study to tattle to their father. So now the heroine was completely confused, wondering if she had messed up somewhere along the line. She glanced at Olga, who for some reason was also avoiding her gaze. But suddenly, the maid gave her a thumbs up, and it was as if a weight had been lifted. Diana's face beamed with happiness, and she expressed her sincere thanks. But Olga thought she shouldn't get too excited, as the young lady's face was quite scary, and maybe she had overdone it a bit. Even now, looking at the heroine's surprised face, the maid understood why a 12-year-old couldn't handle that kind of pressure. Later, Diana decided to ask Olga why she felt relieved, wondering if Regina was really bullying her. The maid didn't even want to think about it. It turned out she had once found small stones in her food. Another time, a dress she had spent a long time mending was completely torn to shreds. There were other little pranks that the heroine knew nothing about, as she wondered if it had been the same in her past life. I need to dig up some dirt on her so I can deal with her later. Olga was stunned again and had to point out that a well-bred young lady would not speak like that. In any case, the maid sincerely thanked her mistress for her support. She never thought Diana would worry about her so much and hadn't expected her to care at all. However, she was still worried that Regina would complain to the master and the mistress would get into trouble because of it. But our girl wasn't worried at all. Maybe things didn't go exactly as planned, but overall, Diana was satisfied with the result. Later, back in her own room, the butler appeared and handed her an invitation to the Viscount's study. The protagonist just smiled and followed him calmly, thinking that her father's behavior was completely expected. The servant was surprised by how confident she looked and decided that this Diana was completely different from Regina. He even felt as if he were seeing the late mistress. He felt that before she arrived, he should warn her that the master was probably with his eldest daughter right now. Just a moment ago, Regina had run to him in tears, and the Viscount was completely panicked. She tried to pretend that nothing had happened, and that's when her father realized it was Diana who had upset her again. The little brat started to feign defending her sister, which made the Viscount even angrier, and he ordered her to be brought in immediately. The butler was sure that our girl had done nothing wrong, and that Regina had a habit of exaggerating. Even if it wasn't fair, she would have to apologize to the master, and then he definitely wouldn't punish her. Diana just smiled calmly in response and decided to take his words to heart. After that, she continued calmly towards her father's study, while the servant was completely bewildered. He watched her leave, wondering when she had grown up so fast. Pushing open the study door, she saw the Viscount with a furious look on his face, while her sister hid behind him. Regina made a face at Diana, and then hid behind her father again. The father was about to explode with anger that this girl dared to look down on his daughter and threatened to kill her. Diana wanted to argue, but then realized that coming from a child's mouth, it really did sound like a threat. The Viscount was about to call Mrs. Williams to complain, but when he saw Diana's face, he was completely stunned. This time, Diana tried even harder to give a sincere apology, but instead of a smile, it turned into an even creepier smirk. The Viscount's face turned pale, and in a trembling voice, he ordered Regina back to her room. He stood between them, constantly shielding his eldest daughter until she finally squeezed past him towards the door. After Regina finally left, he cleared his throat and decided to find out where Diana had learned these things. The protagonist didn't understand what she had done wrong this time, as she had already apologized sincerely with a smile. The Viscount held his head and decided that she was never to show that smile to anyone again. He was still shaken, unable to believe he had been so frightened by his own daughter that he had instinctively reached for his dagger. To him, this was just proof that she needed to give up etiquette lessons and start learning swordsmanship. But Diana stood her ground, refusing to give up Baroness Williams' lessons. Under her determined gaze, her father relented and decided to give her 2 months to master basic etiquette. Soon, they would be choosing a lady-in-waiting for Princess Juliana, and she had to be chosen, or he would send her to the training grounds. Diana was shocked by these conditions, but there was no turning back. She went into the woods for some fresh air, unable to believe that she might become the princess's personal maid. She walked along the edge of the forest, jumped over a log, and came to a secret place that only she knew. She often hid here as a child when her mother scolded her, and it had become a perfect place to think. Diana had indeed agreed to her father's request, but could she really handle the role of a servant to the princess? She picked up a branch from the ground, infused her power into it, and wondered if it was time to just get rid of everyone. Our girl never cared for patriotism, and she had no family or friends, so she could easily sell military secrets to Heberonia and just run over there. She would just have to take Olga with her, but the problem was that no one would believe her word. However, there was one person who might actually believe it, and that was the naive idiot Cornelius Heimann. In her previous life, during the war with Heberonia, Vice Captain Diana suddenly received a letter. It had no seal and no return address, so it was impossible to tell who sent it. After reading the information inside about the enemy country's military secrets, she was completely at a loss. She decided to trust the intelligence and launched an attack. Using this information, it was later discovered that the squad they eliminated was led by Cornelius's older brother. Diana would never have thought that he would use the enemy to get rid of his own brother. This madman would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, so she was sure he would believe her story. But on the other hand, it was better to avoid a lunatic like him altogether, and if they met, our girl would run for her life. Suddenly, she noticed that the color of her power in the branch had turned bright red instead of the usual yellow. Diana was completely shocked and confused, throwing the branch away and jumping back herself. She thought maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her, so she cautiously walked back and picked up the branch again. She channeled her energy into it, and after seeing the yellow glow, she breathed a sigh of relief, deciding she must have been overthinking things. But suddenly, the power began to turn red again, which panicked her even more. She couldn't understand it at all. She had always genuinely hated the color red, and of all the things she possessed, she loved the color of her aura the most. But now, for some reason, it had turned red. Could this be somehow connected to her return to the past? Diana angrily snapped the branch, deciding that if she wanted to remain human, she would never touch a sword again. Meanwhile, the protagonist's father was thanking His Excellency for recommending their Viscounty to the royal family. They had already begun preparing Diana, but the Viscount didn't understand why they would choose his younger daughter for this. In her father's opinion, she wasn't particularly smart, and they were probably just wasting this opportunity. He saw the look he received, and the Viscount immediately lowered his head, deciding to clarify one more thing. Later that day, the father met with his daughters, and to Diana's surprise, he was not alone. She was completely stunned when she heard that this young man would now be her knight, and Regina was so shocked she almost fell over. Ben respectfully greeted his new mistress, saying it was an honor to serve her, and he was glad to see her again. But Diana was mostly just confused, wondering why a royal knight was here and what had happened at the palace. So, she heard that he had resigned from the guard to become her knight, and the protagonist thought, great, another madman. With all the sorrow in the world in her eyes, a tearful Regina looked at them and softly called out to her father. The Viscount turned away without a word and began to walk away, as there was nothing he could do about it. Her sister began to bite her nails in despair, unable to believe that Diana had gotten a knight before her. Meanwhile, the protagonist was still wondering why Ben made that decision. I mean, countless people aspire to be royal knights, right? And a Viscount's title wouldn't really help him move up in the world. But the guy didn't care about that at all. He came from a humble background, and although he was lucky enough to become a court knight, his comrades still treated him like dirt. He remembered what the young lady had said, that a knight is defined by his sword, not his bloodline. Ben had never heard anything like that before, and she was the first person to judge him by his skills rather than his birth. It was then that the man decided that he and his sword would serve only her from now on. Diana understood how he felt. She too had once wanted to be judged by her swordsmanship rather than her gender. So, if this was his decision, it couldn't be changed, and she would just have to accept it. The knight wanted to thank the lady, but suddenly Regina walked up with a big smile and said she was delighted to meet Sir Krull. It dawned on the sister that she no longer had a problem with the knight belonging to Diana. She could just snatch him for herself. She declared that they were practically family now, and then asked the brave warrior if she could call him by his first name. Regina gave the protagonist a triumphant look, thinking everything would fall into place. She was convinced it would be better for him to be her knight than that pathetic Diana's. Ben smiled and replied, asking her not to call him that, then turned back to his mistress. He and the protagonist calmly went to check the grounds, leaving Regina completely dumbfounded. Later, Diana sat confused at a table with a sewing kit in front of her, an essential skill for any lady. Olga was sure everything would work out for her, and wished the young miss good luck and patience. For some reason, this sounded almost like an insult to the protagonist. She focused, picked up the needle to start, but Diana accidentally infused her aura into the needle, which shot right through the fabric. She was shocked when she touched the fabric, not understanding when embroidery had become so dangerous. The The protagonist tried to calm down, reminding herself that she wasn't fighting anyone right now, and decided to try again. Finally, after hours of hard work and intense concentration, Diana finished her first ever piece of embroidery. The design itself certainly left much to be desired, but at least she hadn't poked any more holes in the fabric. Through hard work, and under the strict supervision of Mrs. Williams, the protagonist was slowly learning to be a lady. But as usual, her mentor noticed every detail and thought the young lady's walk lacked soul. She was too aggressive, her gait more like a knight's than a graceful lady's. Diana was shocked by the accuracy of this assessment. She had to admit that true ladies walked as light as a feather, their steps like the flutter of a butterfly's wings. Posture alone couldn't solve everything, and the Baroness hoped the protagonist would understand that. But Diana was completely clueless, so William sighed and decided to call it a day. Later, the protagonist sat on the stairs, wondering why it was so hard for a lady to walk. Suddenly, she saw Regina walking across the hall and noticed her gait was perfect. At that moment, the sister felt a chill run down her spine. Diana thought maybe she should try to imitate her. Then it suddenly occurred to her that there was a much better role model than Regina. The most perfect lady our girl knew was her late mother. As a princess, she knew everything about royal etiquette. Diana tried her best to remember everything about her mother, especially the way she walked. When walking, her mother would turn her whole body in the direction she wanted to go. Shoulders back, her steps were steady and small. Our girl took a deep breath and decided to try to completely imitate her mother's movements. Meanwhile, in the Heimann Grand Duchy, a servant rushed to his master with urgent news. His Highness thought Cornelius had done something crazy again, but according to the man, it was much more serious this time. A group of servants crowded into a room, staring in disbelief at the training grounds. Standing in the middle of the field was the Grand Duke's second son, swinging a sword under Walter's watchful eye. His father arrived in person, unable to figure out what on earth Cornelius was up to now. This genius had shown a very high IQ from a young age, but unfortunately, he was physically very weak. The cause was a strange condition called choleric thirst, which made him sensitive and irritable. So when his patience finally ran out, it manifested as completely bizarre behavior. Faced with the Grand Duke's question, Cornelius remained silent, so Walter decided to interject. But His Highness wasn't having it and ordered the boy to follow him to the study. He didn't know what had gotten into his son to make him want to learn swordsmanship. It wasn't his strong suit, and considering Cornelius got winded just climbing to the 4th floor, he should know that himself. Moreover, he had dismissed his tutor for no reason, and the Grand Duke was curious what was wrong with him this time. When he heard the boy say there was nothing more to learn from him, the man gave him a stern look. It turned out that in the last lesson, Cornelius had thrown a pile of books in front of his tutor, leaving him completely overwhelmed. The boy felt that if the tutor still disagreed after reading them, then maybe he would write him a letter. If that were the case, our little hero would certainly reply. But until then, their lessons were over. As it turned out, the tutor did write a letter, calling the Grand Duke's second son an arrogant little bastard. Cornelius thought, listening to his nonsense almost made his ears fall off. So what else could he do? His father thought about it and decided that, in that case, his son could learn directly from him. This basically meant the Grand Duke wanted to make him his heir. But the boy didn't think much of it and immediately refused the offer. His Highness instantly lost his composure, which greatly surprised Cornelius. Recalling the nickname his father often called him as a child, the Grand Duke always compared him to some kind of little monster. The father was speechless at this and just slumped down in defeat. Cornelius gave a scornful smile, turned, and headed for the door. He saw the title of Grand Duke as another shackle and hoped his foolish older brother would take his place. Walter met him outside the study, hoping the young master was all right. The servant thought the master had probably scolded him and that Cornelius would surely stop training now. He was about to suggest going to the library, but suddenly the little hero decided to go to the training grounds and to continue. He was tired of being so physically weak, and Cornelius wanted to push himself to the absolute limit. Later, Walter decided to ask him why he suddenly wanted to learn swordsmanship when he couldn't even be bothered to move before. The little hero was always buried in books, spending all his free time immersed in them, except for eating and sleeping. Cornelius asked in return if Walter Walter met the girl from his dreams in real life, would he believe his eyes? The servant was taken aback by the question, but Cornelius didn't care if he believed him or not. The little hero knew that she loved her sword, which confused Walter even more. The servant thought, no way, did the young master really go all the way to Agrafan for this? But Cornelius told him to shut up, thinking that if the protagonist lived in his own country, he would try to lure her with candy or a sword. But now, things would be much more difficult, so he needed to find a different angle. While Walter was freaking out that the young master had gone mad, the hero decided to use the war to his advantage. He could just snatch her from the battlefield. The thought sent a thrill of excitement through him. Meanwhile, the servant felt that this mysterious girl should run for her life and never look back, because she was being hunted. At this moment, in the royal palace of Agrafan, the princess was taking a walk with her attendants. Those around her were captivated by her grace, thinking the king must be very proud to have such a daughter. Juliana Agrafina was the only legitimate princess in the country. But besides her, there was the king's illegitimate daughter, Agnes, who was now happily running towards her sister. The princess was surprised to run into her sister here. It turned out Agnes really wanted to see her because she had heard that Juliana was getting a new confidant soon. She felt her sister was very lucky and thought that if she also lived in the palace, she would play with her all the time. The girl was frustrated that this wasn't the case and was always jealous of the princess, who now remained perfectly calm. Juliana continued to walk calmly, while Agnes just kept circling around her. The girl was wondering if her father would grant her wish if she wanted to move into the palace. Then the princess sighed with concern, thinking that Agnes might be thirsty and should have some tea. The girl immediately refused, but her sister was worried that her constant talking might damage her vocal cords. Agnes was touched by this concern and was glad her sister cared about her. She kept exclaiming how wonderful it was to be related to such an amazing person, while Juliana just looked back at her calmly. Afterward, the girl ran off, saying she would visit again another day, and then the princess turned to her maid, Margaret. Juliana felt that the next time her half-sister came to the palace, she had better take a walk in a different garden. Meanwhile, she knew she definitely did not like Agnes. Moreover, she had learned from a maid that her new lady-in-waiting would be Diana Lesley, the Viscount's second daughter, who was related to the royal family. Hearing that her mother was Princess Vivian, Juliana felt her father had been too harsh, marrying her off to a Viscount. Margaret quickly clarified that she was also his second wife, which left the princess completely bewildered. Ultimately, our girl successfully became the princess's lady-in-waiting, and the Viscount was ecstatic. The lady looked at her student with tears in her eyes, feeling that all the training had been worth it. Diana took this as a compliment, knowing she had become so excellent entirely due to her mentor's hard work. These words deeply moved the Baroness, who was overwhelmed by Diana's kindness. But at the same time, Mrs. Williams completely agreed, as this was the craziest challenge she had ever set for herself. In any case, she now considered Diana a proper lady, and becoming the princess's attendant would be a great start for her. Diana swore she would never forget this, and for now, she needed to hurry into the carriage. Ben stood at the carriage door, politely offering his hand to his mistress, and then mounted his horse to escort her. Besides Mrs. Williams, her father and sister also came to see her off, quietly watching her leave. As the carriage drove away, Regina wondered if the Viscount had really sent her sister there, or if it was just some kind of mistake. She was sure Diana would mess something up in front of the princess, but her father said the decision was made and there was no turning back. So the girl could only stand there alone, completely powerless to change anything. The carriage arrived at the palace, and Ben asked his mistress if she was nervous about meeting Her Highness. Just as he thought, the protagonist did have mixed feelings, but it was more anticipation than worry, as the palace was almost a second home to her. The knight felt she had nothing to be nervous about, as the princess was very kind and mature, just like Diana. In fact, the protagonist knew exactly what Juliana was like, which was why she wanted to keep her distance. At the entrance, Diana was greeted by the princess's headmaid, who wanted to brief the newcomer on her duties. But first, she began to circle her, examining her closely from all angles. Fortunately, the protagonist was dressed just right, and from now on, she had better dress just as appropriately. After that, the headmaid ordered the newcomer to follow her and decided to remind her that from now on, she would be representing the face of Her Highness. This meant that Diana's reputation would directly affect the princesses. Walking to the door of the drawing room where Her Highness was waiting, the woman knocked and heard an invitation to enter. The protagonist immediately went inside, and the princess was delighted to finally meet her. Diana was struck by her beauty and respectfully greeted Her Highness. Juliana had never had a friend her own age before, so she was genuinely looking forward to getting to know her. Besides, they were relatives, which meant they could definitely become good friends. The protagonist considered it an honor, and, for just a split second, she noticed a strange glint in the princess's eyes. After the introductions, the girls sat down for tea, and the princess asked if she could call her lady-in-waiting by her first name. Diana considered it a matter of course, which made Her Highness very happy. There would be a tea party soon, and Juliana very much hoped the protagonist would attend. Diana was flattered by the invitation and happily agreed. The princess decided she would introduce her to everyone then. Her Highness at this moment looked just like any ordinary girl, which was a little creepy to our girl. That evening, Diana returned home, and Olga immediately rushed over to ask how her first day at the palace had been. The maid's curious gaze made her uneasy, so she just said that the princess was generally very friendly. But at one point, looking at Her Highness, our girl felt a strange sense of discomfort. Olga started to worry, so Diana changed the subject, mentioning that she had been invited to tea. The lady-in-waiting found this incredible, convinced the young lady was incredibly lucky, but to her surprise, Diana wasn't happy at all and instead fell into deep thought. She pretended to be tired and in need of rest, shooing away the lady-in-waiting who wanted to say more. Meanwhile, Juliana was calmly playing chess when the head lady-in-waiting suddenly approached her. The lady-in-waiting wanted to point out that the tea party time Her Highness the Princess told Miss Lesley was incorrect. She was completely bewildered when she learned that the princess was well aware of this and intended to let things take their course. Since this girl wanted to become the princess's confidant, Juliana decided to test her personally. Anything could happen in high society, and since the protagonist was her lady-in-waiting, she needed to know how to handle such situations. So we must let things be, and the head lady-in-waiting could go back to her duties. The lady-in-waiting was confused, as Her Highness was always reasonable, and this was the first time she had been so outrageous. The next morning, Juliana came early to check on the preparations for the tea party. It was her first time hosting such an event, so she wanted everything to be perfect. The servants quickly assured her that everything was going smoothly and there was nothing to worry about. The princess thought to herself that everything should be perfect today, except for the fact that her lady-in-waiting would be late. Juliana couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she finally showed up. But just then, a maid suddenly mentioned that thanks to the lady sent by Her Highness, everything was proceeding very smoothly. Just then, Diana was leisurely nearby, chatting pleasantly with some high society individuals. Watching her sample the pastries with a triumphant look, the princess wondered, where on earth did she pop out from? Upon seeing the princess, the protagonist hurried over to greet her and praised the fine weather. Juliana, suppressing her confusion, had no choice but to ask her why she had arrived so early. Diana pretended she had mistaken the time and almost missed it, but luckily she had come early to check out the palace gardens. The princess, gripping her fan with a trembling hand, thought, does this little brat really think I'd fall for that nonsense? Diana simply smiled calmly, knowing that Her Highness was completely thrown off because things hadn't gone according to plan. Seriously, it was as if this cunning little minx actually thought she could fool her with that line. However, not a chance. Diana had lived in this palace for over 20 years as a royal knight. This morning, she had left early, pretending everything was normal, much to Olga's surprise. As the only female knight in the entire palace, she had endured all sorts of harassment, but over time, she learned how to deal with it. All she did was wake up earlier than everyone else and put in twice the effort, so no one would have any reason to complain. When she arrived at the tea party, she was surprised to find everything already prepared and the table set. Realizing the party was about to begin, our protagonist understood the situation and decided to lend the servants a hand. Now, she was serving the princess a plate of very delicious-looking cookies. As she did so, Diana thought to herself that this little girl would need another 20 years before she could possibly win against her. Afterwards, the princess's friends respectfully greeted Her Highness, and the princess thanked them for taking the time to come. Meanwhile, many people were seeing the princess's new lady-in-waiting for the first time and watched her with great interest. Everyone was wondering where such a lovely lady had come from, and what she would be like in the future if she was already so charming. Once everyone was seated, Juliana spoke, formally introducing her new personal lady-in-waiting and friend, Diana Lesley, to the guests. The ladies were delighted to meet the Viscount's daughter, and our protagonist greeted everyone one by one. Some were shocked by the elegance of her demeanor, especially considering how young she was. Diana felt she still had much to learn and hoped they would help her master court etiquette. But the attention on her grew, with some thinking she was being overly modest, while others were sizing up her stunning dress. Goodness, Juliana thought. She was surprised too, because Diana's etiquette, style, and the way she spoke were exactly like those of a season knight. Our protagonist just gave her a confused look, which the guests mistook for a joke. Still, a few ladies detected a hint of a knight's aura from her splendid dress. Someone guessed she might have practiced with a sword, but others disagreed, saying Diana's hands were too delicate. Stunned by these discussions, our protagonist quickly explained that she spent all day learning etiquette and had no time for knightly pursuits. Juliana just watched it all unfold leisurely, chuckling to herself. This cunning little brat was already getting on Diana's nerves, and she glared at her through gritted teeth. When the tea party finally ended, the exhausted protagonist wearily climbed into her carriage. Ben peeked in through the window, wanting to know how her first tea party went. The knight himself wasn't worried at all, knowing Her Highness would surely take good care of her. He hoped he wasn't mistaken and that the princess was the kindest person ever. Diana felt he needed to experience Juliana's bullshit firsthand to understand how she felt. But the protagonist remembered that the princess's personality was completely different in her past life, and what was happening now was confusing because they had only just met and Juliana had no reason to hate Diana. But if the protagonist were kicked out of the palace now, her father would think she was useless and force her to take up the sword. So she couldn't just sit back and wait. She had to win the princess over to her side. The next day, Diana decided to ask Olga what girls the princess's age like. The maid found it strange to hear this question from someone of the same age, a fact our protagonist always forgot. But Olga then recalled that romance novels had recently become very popular among girls, and they were not just popular with commoners. Young nobles loved them too. Diana perked up at this and decided to drag Olga to a bookstore later. They entered the shop, and the clerk asked if they were looking for anything in particular. The maid thought her lady wanted something befitting her status, but our protagonist was already looking at the shelves. She had never seen so many books in one place, and realized her life was completely lacking in reading. She found a romance novel and, out of curiosity, decided to read a little. In the book, Rosalina gazed at the middle-aged woman sitting across from her. The lady wanted to bribe her with jewels to make her forget her son's existence, but she refused. The woman started yelling at her, and Rosalina felt the old hag was just misunderstanding. But the madam immediately put her in her place, telling her to never dream of calling her mother. How could a pitiful nobody like her get close to her precious baby boy? Rosalina realized there was no point in delaying any longer and decided to confess that she was already pregnant with a child. After reading a few chapters of the story, Diana completely lost track of time. The book was so captivating, only eggs were better. Olga was completely stunned when she overheard her lady wanting to stab some old hag. The next day, the protagonist went back to see the princess, whose days were unchanging. She would sometimes take a walk, but mostly she studied and had tea after lunch. Whenever Juliana took a break, Diana was supposed to accompany her, and this time she brought Her Highness a gift. The princess picked up the romance novel, glanced skeptically at the cover, and coldly said she didn't read such things. She had neither the time nor the interest to read the kind of vulgar trash that only empty-headed nobles enjoyed. Although Juliana thanked her for the generous gesture, she still had to refuse the gift. The protagonist smiled sweetly, inwardly cursing her for being an old stick in the mud, because you could tell from the first page that the book was great. She discovered that in her free time, the princess would read books full of advice, take walks, or embroider, and also play chess. Juliana understood the surprise on Diana's face, because in their kingdom, everyone firmly believed that chess was only for men. No one in the palace could play with her, and the princess often played alone, so the protagonist decided to volunteer as her opponent. Juliana was quite surprised by the offer and immediately ordered a servant to bring the chessboard. When the game began, she made a point of letting me know that she wouldn't go easy on novice. Diana just smiled in response, not wanting Her Highness to get worked up over such a small thing. Half an hour later, bam, our protagonist checkmated her opponent, completely crushing her spirit. Stunned by the move, Juliana felt it was just a fluke and demanded another game. A few minutes later, the princess's face turned pale with shock as she tasted defeat for the 10th time in a row. She couldn't figure out why Diana was so good at chess. Did she have some kind of innate talent? Our protagonist pretended it was just good luck, but she knew Juliana would never understand the real reason for her chess skills. The princess wanted to play another game, but just then, the head lady-in-waiting appeared. Upon hearing that Lady Agnes had arrived, Her Highness's expression immediately turned serious. Shortly after, a little girl with pink hair happily greeted her big sister. Furthermore, Agnes was delighted to finally meet Juliana's new friend, the one she had heard so much about. Well, although she was the child of the king's mistress, she still bore the royal surname, which meant the king was truly fond of her. Diana respectfully greeted the girl, but she just ignored her and ran straight to her sister. Hearing that she wanted to play with Juliana, the protagonist was very surprised, as she thought they weren't that close. Just then, the princess decided Agnes needed to learn some manners and properly greet Miss Lesley. The girl pretended to think hard, as if she couldn't figure out why she needed to do that. Juliana frowned, feeling that she would be blamed for this behavior. Just then, the protagonist felt this strong tension in the air and knew their relationship was terrible. Agnes acted very surprised, as if she couldn't imagine anyone would blame her for anything. The head lady-in-waiting quickly intervened, pointing out that the girl was old enough to know better and should mind her manners. Diana thought Agnes was about to burst into tears, but the child just smiled, remembering she had always been this way without any problems, so it was no big deal. In fact, she felt her sister worried about her too much. Now, the protagonist was truly scared, hoping the princess wouldn't fly into a rage and destroy the place. Seeing Juliana busy with her guest, Agnes decided to ditch them and slip away. She walked past Diana, who caught a glimpse of a wicked smile on the little girl's face. The princess was clearly about to lose control too, but she was better at hiding it, except for the throbbing vein on her forehead. Agnes's status might be higher than Juliana's, and she looked like a harmless little thing. Suddenly, the princess turned to the protagonist and asked if she was just going to stand there and endure that condescending look. Diana didn't know what she could do, but Juliana gave her permission to use her as protection. The protagonist couldn't fall for the little brat's tricks, especially when her reputation was tied to the princess's. Juliana sighed, exhausted, and decided to let her lady-in-waiting go home and rest for the day. Diana had thought Her Highness disliked her, but it turned out that wasn't the case at all. The princess always spoke in hints and roundabout ways, venting her anger whenever she got the chance, like a helpless child. But even so, there was nothing the protagonist could do, so she had no choice but to leave. Meanwhile, Juliana went to the balcony where they played chess, wanting to relax and get some fresh air. Her head was throbbing, and suddenly she saw the romance novel Diana had forgotten on the table. She picked up the book and turned to the first page, curious about what was so special about this piece of trashy literature. From the very first page, the writing was terrible, completely lacking in realism, and there wasn't a shred of educational value in the text. After a while, the head lady-in-waiting brought the princess some calming tea, as Agnes's visits always gave her a headache. The lady-in-waiting smiled, as always, and presented the tray to her mistress, but Her Highness didn't even move. Just then, Juliana was so engrossed in her book that she didn't even hear the maid enter. The lady placed the tray beside her, thinking she should point out that the tea was good for headaches. The princess still didn't react, so the head lady-in-waiting gently nudged her shoulder, and she finally took notice. Juliana looked distracted, so, thinking she might be unwell, the maid mentioned the tea again. Feeling the matter wasn't urgent, Her Highness buried her nose back in the book. She decided she was fine. The maid wasn't so sure, but then she was ordered to leave the tea and go back to her work. As she left, the maid glanced back and saw the princess's eyes glued to the book, blindly fumbling for something on the table. Worried she would spill the tea on herself, the head lady-in-waiting hurried back to help before it was too late. But then she saw Her Highness pick up a cookie and calmly start eating it. While reading the book, the woman breathed a sigh of relief, and Juliana soon felt the tension in her body easing. As time went on, Diana got used to coming to the palace almost every day. More importantly, her relationship with the princess also began to improve noticeably day by day. But unfortunately, the good times didn't last. One day, when she arrived at Her Highness's chambers, the head lady-in-waiting told her the princess had ordered that no one be allowed in. Diana immediately wanted to know what had happened and found out they had a difficult problem. Apparently, the king had decided to bring his illegitimate daughter, Agnes, to the palace. The head lady-in-waiting knew Juliana wouldn't even let her in at a time like this, so Diana could leave. Despite this, our protagonist decided to go see her mistress and told the head lady-in-waiting she didn't have to worry. Diana also knew the princess had been locking herself in her room for several days. From what she knew of Her Highness, she probably couldn't open up to anyone and was just bottling everything up inside. Lost in thought, perhaps the little girl was sitting there crying all alone right now. Surprised to find a ball of cotton on the floor, the protagonist saw the princess ahead, sitting on the floor with her back to her. Diana carefully called out to her, and in that moment, Juliana froze with scissors in her hand and a look of utter confusion on her face. A teddy bear lay on the floor in front of her, and she had been cutting pieces off it. Blushing with shame, she quickly tried to hide everything, and Her Highness began to shout, ordering Diana to get out at once. The protagonist was stunned. She had never seen the elegant and composed princess in such a state. Juliana immediately jumped to her feet with a straight face, deciding she was just extremely annoyed that her orders had been ignored. Still staring in shock at a piece of cotton in her hair, Diana felt that was just how it was. The princess decided that since her lady-in-waiting was already here, why not play a game of chess? It was then that Diana finally realized that Her Highness wasn't such a bad person after all. Meanwhile, Cornelius was still keeping up with his daily training when, bam, he lost his balance during a session. He fell to the ground with a twisted ankle, and Walter felt the young master was pushing himself too hard. The nanny was also worried about him, and the servant thought perhaps he should take a break. But the boy got back on his feet, wiped the sweat from his brow, and decided it was too early to give up. He knew that in the past, the protagonist used to cry alone at night. No one comforted her, and she did everything to gain recognition, but sometimes she still cried alone. When her hands were covered in wounds and scars, she became a true knight. That's why Cornelius felt he couldn't rest, couldn't waste a single minute, and had to become a knight no matter what. Years later, Diana still visited the princess, serving as her personal lady-in-waiting. She overheard Olga saying that a delegation from the Hebrian Empire was about to arrive. Realizing her chance had finally come, she wanted to head to the palace as soon as possible. Shortly after, Ben arrived safely at the imperial palace, ready to lend his lady a hand. Standing before Ben was the wall, the one that had stunted his growth. Later, while walking with him along the palace grounds, she decided to ask the knight if he had made any progress. Ben saw no reason to worry and was sure he could overcome that wall to better protect his lady. But Diana hoped he was doing it not for her, but for himself. If he had stayed in the palace, he would be in a high position by now. So she believed he could do it for the off chance that she might actually need his help. With Hebrian making its move, it meant war was coming, and it couldn't be avoided. Later, Diana was having tea with the princess, who called her name several times. Diana didn't react at all, and Juliana wondered what on earth she was thinking about so intently. Was she seeing someone? Diana was startled by the question, and then the princess gestured with her eyes. Sitting over there was a young nobleman who was clearly smitten with her. He kept sending her longing glances and puffing out his chest like a damn pigeon. Just looking at him made Diana feel sick, and she wished Her Highness would stop making such jokes. That was Viscount Bailey's son, whose family was very rich and had only recently acquired their title. Diana wasn't interested in any of that and wasn't even sure if he was looking at her. Just then, the young man flicked his hair and winked directly at Diana. Even the princess was embarrassed and turned her head away, silently apologizing to Diana in her mind. Meanwhile, the other nobles began to chatter, discussing the news of the Hebrian delegation's arrival. Hearing that they wanted to form an alliance with the kingdom of Agrafena, Her Highness's shoulders visibly slumped. The alliance was to be forged through a political marriage, creating a strong bond between the royal families. Juliana was the only princess in the country, and whether she liked it or not, she would be the top candidate for the role. The princess immediately composed herself, deciding the delegation was only coming to discuss the possibility of a marriage between the two nations. The nobles quickly pointed out that the country already had a crown princess, and their crown prince was already engaged. So were they seriously thinking of making her the crown prince's second wife? This was a huge insult to all of Agrafena. They immediately started to cause a ruckus, but Juliana sternly ordered them to be quiet and reminded them that the empire had its own laws. Whatever decision her father made, she was prepared to accept it as long as it was for the good of the country. Meanwhile, Diana knew that although Her Highness appeared calm, she was secretly seething with anger inside. At the same time, Cornelius finally arrived in the territory with Walter via portal. Every time the servant came to this place, he was always amazed by how fertile the land was. It was a huge difference from Hebrian and other countries, which was why so many tried to get a piece of it. The hero increasingly felt that Diana would soon belong to him. After the party, the princess personally escorted all the guests to the exit. Then she breathed a sigh of relief and decided to find out where the protagonist was now. Learning that she had gone to deliver a gift to the palace, the princess hurried to see her. But Diana looked as if she had seen a ghost, and Juliana had been really worried about her lately. The protagonist didn't react to her calls at all, and the princess wondered why she was being so quiet. She placed a hand on her lady-in-waiting's shoulder, and suddenly Diana instinctively flipped her to the ground. When she came to her senses, the protagonist was completely baffled, not understanding why Her Highness was sprawled on the cold floor. Juliana was startled by this, and in a trembling voice, she decided to remind her whose fault it was that she was in this predicament. Realizing what she had done, Diana turned pale with panic, while the princess howled from the pain in her back. The protagonist immediately rushed to help her up, hoping she was okay. Juliana scoffed, thinking Diana must be out of her mind if she thought she could get away with something like this. Cursing her old habits, the protagonist apologized profusely, but Her Highness was more interested in what she had been thinking about so intently just now. She really wanted to know the reason behind that crazy shoulder throw, but Diana remained stubbornly silent and looked away, which only confused the princess even more. She couldn't understand. Did the heroine really want to be punished for disobeying an order and harming a member of the royal family? That wasn't it at all, but Diana didn't know how to explain it to her, as Juliana was acting so composed. Before the last portal to Heberunia, even before setting foot in their land, the princess would be killed. After Her Highness's death, relations between the two nations would be at a breaking point. A war would break out as a result. In fact, before all this happened, the heroine had intended to flee to a neighboring country. But now, this blonde princess from Agrafon had ruined her plans. Diana didn't want to get involved at first, since she didn't have long to live anyway. But now the heroine couldn't just watch her go to her death, so she had to figure something out. One person can't stop a war, and Diana had no intention of becoming a hero destined to fail. So now, the heroine decided to explain to her that it was difficult to put into words, but she would tell her everything once she had a better grasp of the situation. Juliana refused immediately, not understanding why her lady-in-waiting would dare to evade the question. So Diana pretended she had received news that something terrible had happened back home, and that she had to return at once. The princess grabbed her hand, saying, "Honestly, who would just let a hero go?" It took all of Diana's effort to make her excuse sound plausible, but she finally managed to pull away. But that was as far as the good ideas went, because she wasn't sure what the priority was, nor did she know what to do next. They couldn't just stroll away with the princess of a nation. They would surely be hunted down. Besides, even if they found a place to hide, it wouldn't prevent the war. The two nations would always find a reason to fight. Meanwhile, Ben noticed his lady's thoughtful expression and wondered what was bothering her so much. The heroine decided to avoid the question, simply pretending to be deep in thought. The knight knew he wasn't very good at these things, and wasn't sure if he could be of any help to his lady. But a trouble shared is a trouble halved, and a joy shared is a joy multiplied. Therefore, he would always be there to listen regardless, and for that, Diana was very grateful. Meanwhile, Regina watched them from the corner, chewing on her napkin in jealousy. She suddenly approached to have tea with Ben, catching him completely by surprise. She pretended she just wanted to relax, but she actually wanted to help him break through that wall and overcome his obstacles. The man was a top-class knight. He would have been promoted long ago if he weren't stuck here. Just as he was about to say that he wasn't good at relaxing with tea, Diana chimed in to reassure him, saying that she used to be terrible at it too. Just a few years ago, she couldn't even greet people properly, but thanks to a wonderful teacher, she learned everything. She practiced her curtsies in high heels every day until her feet were killing her. Ben couldn't picture it all, because from the moment he met her, she had been a perfect lady. Thinking that there's a first time for everything, she knew he would eventually break through whatever was holding him back. So Diana wanted to give him a little push, just enough for him to figure out on his own. Then he recalled the words of Baroness Williams, who said that a lady should be like flowers and jewels. At first, it just sounded beautiful, but in truth, both of those things are meant to be admired by others, aren't they? But the heroine didn't want to be that kind of lady, so she chose her own path. In her past life, she had only followed orders, and Diana felt as if she had lost herself. She had never made a decision for herself, merely a pawn on a chessboard. So she didn't want Ben to live that kind of life either, knowing that once he understood, whatever shackled him would fall apart. The knight was still digesting her words, realizing that within her story, there was a path for him as well. Diana smiled, saying that if one had to make a comparison, their paths might be somewhat similar. Later, the heroine was reading in her room when Regina entered to say that their father was waiting for her. Composed, Diana stood up, walked toward the door, and went right past her sister. Suddenly, the girl grabbed her arm, and Diana simply looked back at her calmly. Regina wanted to know what exactly was going on between her sister and Sir Clowell, what had transpired between them. Diana was taken aback by the insane question. She considered their relationship to be merely that of a lady and her knight, and hoped that answer would suffice. She didn't know what was going on in her sister's head, but she wanted no part of it. The heroine kept walking, hoping never to hear such a question again. It was downright insulting. Regina was infuriated by her words, and concluded that she was the one who had been insulted. She didn't understand why it was always Diana, Diana, Diana. Ben's lady, the princess's friend, all of it. After a moment, the heroine thought that her sister had never had any of those things to begin with. To her surprise, Regina actually agreed that it was none of her business. But deep inside, her sister felt that none of it should belong to Diana either. It was as if everything had started to go wrong from the moment she refused to pick up a sword. The heroine was utterly confused by her words and shocked that Regina was blaming her for everything. As she walked away, she had a sudden realization that perhaps her sister's words weren't so crazy after all. Because of her, things really had gone awry, and Diana had never thought of it that way. With so much having happened, she began to question why she had returned to the past at all. She wondered if anyone would believe her if she told them her story. Meanwhile, she went to see her father and was immediately told of a marriage proposal for her. Her father saw nothing strange about it. Since the princess was to be married soon, Diana would no longer be her lady-in-waiting, so it was time for her to find a husband as well. The heroine didn't understand which family they were referring to, only to discover that the son of Viscount Badley was quite taken with her. At the thought of that odd man from the palace, Diana shivered and froze completely. Her vision went dark, and she collapsed to the floor, with a butler rushed to support her. She later awoke in her bed, just as Olga was bringing her some hot soup. The maid couldn't imagine the amount of stress she must have been under to faint in her master's study. Diana quickly explained that it wasn't the news of marriage that shocked her, but who the groom was. She was more fragile now, both in body and mind, than before, but she still enjoyed being a lady. Just then, the butler burst in with an urgent message. The princess was looking for the heroine. Meanwhile, Cornelius, as the ambassador from Heberonia, arrived at the palace in Agraphon and expressed his thanks for the warm welcome. The king felt it was his duty to host them properly, as their two nations were allies. Walter was impressed with the young master's ability to handle his duties. He had been sweating nervously when Cornelius volunteered to lead the delegation, but everything went smoothly, and he successfully concluded the negotiations. Remember when he first picked up a sword? We all thought he'd give up in a few days, but now he's a true knight. After concluding his meeting with His Majesty, the male protagonist decided to head back to his room with his servant. The mood was good. The negotiations had gone exceptionally well. Walter felt that his master's dream had been prophetic. The servant also recalled the red-haired lady from the dream, the one his master kept mentioning. Even the servant was now curious about where she was and what she was doing. As it turned out, Cornelius had no idea either. Walter was astonished by this. The male protagonist hadn't looked into anything about her yet. The problem was that if Cornelius started investigating, it would bring her unwanted trouble. For her sake, he had to lie low. The servant was shocked by this. When had the young master become so considerate? That aside, our male protagonist wanted to know if the servant had sensed any divine power in Agriphon, like the white aura Cornelius had possessed since he was a child, but a little different. Perhaps there was someone else in this kingdom who also possessed divine power. But Walter was more interested in hearing about the lady. He had heard from his master that she was a knight, and he wanted to know just how strong this girl was. The male protagonist mused that he had never met anyone stronger than her. When she wielded her sword, it was as if the entire world stood still for her. The servant suddenly spotted a red-haired lady up ahead and asked if that could be her. Just then, the heroine, having just arrived at the imperial palace, was walking along the path toward the main building. To see Her Highness. Walter was shocked by how well she matched his master's description, and Cornelius himself was stunned into silence. Her attire was a far cry from a knight's gear, and it was unclear why she was here. Shouldn't she be on the training grounds right now, in theory? And so, Diana Lesley, the second daughter of the Viscount, ran into the envoys from the Hebernian Empire and offered them a standard curtsy. The male protagonist desperately wanted to know why she was here. He tried to act casual and nonchalant, but he completely blew it, blurting out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" The servant went pale, thinking that his young master desperately needed to get a grip. The heroine just stared at him in confusion, and then, with a jolt, it suddenly hit her.